A very dangerous fault beneath the Caribbean just released, and it did not release quietly. On the evening of June 24th, 2026, the coast of north-central Venezuela moved twice within 39 seconds. A magnitude 7.24 shock followed almost immediately by a magnitude 7.5 main shock, together forming one of the most damaging earthquake doubles to strike the Western Hemisphere in over a century. As of the most recent count, more than 5,500 people have been confirmed dead, over 16,700 injured, and tens of thousands remain missing. Entire neighborhoods in La Guaira collapsed, with roughly 80% of buildings in that state reduced to rubble. And now scientists studying the fault system responsible are asking the question that matters most for everyone living along this stretch of the planet: what happens next? The earthquake struck along a structure called the Bocono San Sebastian El Pilar fault system, an enormous strike-slip boundary stretching more than 1,300 kilometers from the Venezuelan Andes all the way east to Trinidad. This single fault system is responsible for most of the magnitude 7 and larger earthquakes Venezuela has recorded since the year 1530, including a great magnitude 7.7 event in 1900 that most likely ruptured the offshore section of the same fault. The June 2026 earthquakes occurred at what researchers describe as a hinge point in that system, the spot where the northeast trending Bocono Fault, the master fault running through the Venezuelan Andes, meets the east-west San Sebastian Fault carrying slip along the central coast. Seismologist Lucy Jones described the event bluntly as one of the really great, very difficult, very damaging earthquakes, a combination of enormous magnitude striking directly beneath dense population centers. If you're finding this as unsettling as I did digging into it, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow. What makes this story far from over is the simple geological fact that this fault system does not end at Venezuela's eastern border. Continuing east past the capital region, the same structure carries on as the El Pilar Fault, running toward the Paria Peninsula and directly toward the islands of Trinidad and Tobago. This is the same extended fault system, not a separate or unrelated structure, meaning the stress released in Venezuela and the stress still sitting further east are mechanically connected pieces of one continuous plate boundary. Researchers describe the master strand of this fault family as slipping at close to 1 centimeter per year, an order of magnitude faster than any neighboring fault in the region, which is precisely why it has produced such a long, violent history of major earthquakes. The connection between Venezuela's rupture and the risk sitting further east became impossible to ignore less than a month later. On July 20th, 2026, a magnitude 5.4 earthquake struck the Caribbean Sea near Tobago, waking residents across the island to shaking that was widely felt, though it caused no reported injuries or structural damage, thanks largely to its depth of 73 kilometers below the surface. That quake occurred on the same locked boundary between the Caribbean and South American plates that runs beneath Trinidad and Tobago, a section of the fault system that researchers have studied closely for years, and the timing raised an immediate and serious question among seismologists monitoring the region, whether the Venezuela rupture had begun transferring stress eastward into segments of the fault that had not yet released their own accumulated energy. If this kind of deep science content is something you want more of, make sure you subscribe, because there is a lot more of this coming. Research published in the journal Tectonics back in 2021 had already identified this exact stretch of boundary near Trinidad and Tobago as locked, meaning stress there has been accumulating rather than releasing gradually over time, and theoretically capable of producing an earthquake as powerful as magnitude 8. To put that number in perspective, a magnitude 8 earthquake on this boundary would release roughly 5.6 times more energy than the magnitude 7.5 event that had already devastated Venezuela in June. Researchers studying this risk are careful to describe it as structural and real, rather than imminent in any predictable sense, meaning nobody can say with confidence when or whether that specific segment will rupture, only that the physical conditions required for a major release are genuinely present and have been documented independently of the recent Venezuela earthquakes. The evidence that this fault system is actively transferring stress across enormous distances is not limited to the Tobago quake alone. In the days following the Venezuela disaster, geologists in Trinidad reported something that left them baffled but not entirely surprised. A portion of the island's southwestern coastline, in the district of Galfa, had been physically jacked upward by at least 20 feet. Residents woke to find elevated sections of shoreline that had not existed before the earthquakes, and immediately connected the change to the Venezuela rupture and the dozens of aftershocks that followed it. This kind of sudden coastal uplift is a direct physical signature of enormous tectonic forces redistributing themselves across the plate boundary, and its appearance on Trinidad's coast more than 100 miles from the Y. Original rupture underscores just how interconnected this entire fault system genuinely is. Understanding the deeper structure of this earthquake requires looking at the fault the Venezuela doublet actually ruptured versus the fault researchers had long expected might eventually break. The Boconó Fault itself, the master structure running through the Venezuelan Andes, last ruptured in a major event back in 1812 and has been accumulating what geologists call a slip. Deficit, ever since, energy that has never been released and continues building with each passing year. That accumulated deficit alone was considered capable of eventually producing an earthquake in the magnitude 7.0 to 7.6 range. The June 2026 doublet, however, actually occurred on the connected San Sebastian segment near Umare, and in the Caribbean Sea northwest of Caracas, meaning the Boconó Fault's own long overdue slip deficit was not the structure that released this time. That older, still locked segment of the system remains sitting there today, its accumulated stress fundamentally unaddressed by what just happened along the coast. This detail matters enormously for how scientists think about what comes next. Rather than resolving the region's overall low seismic hazard, the June earthquakes released stress specifically along one section of an extremely long, interconnected fault network while leaving other heavily loaded segments, including the historic Boconó Fault itself and the locked boundary near Trinidad and Tobago, essentially untouched or potentially even more stressed than before. Earthquakes are known to redistribute stress onto neighboring fault segments as part of the rupture process itself, sometimes bringing those segments measurably closer to their own breaking point rather than further away from it. That is precisely the mechanism. Researchers are now watching closely across the full length of this fault system, from the Venezuelan Andes through Caracas and out toward Trinidad. The human stakes attached to this ongoing risk are severe. Aid organizations have noted that Venezuela was already deeply vulnerable, heading into this disaster with close to 8 million of its 28 million residents already in need of humanitarian assistance before the earthquake struck. Coastal Trinidad and Tobago, along with neighboring islands, including Aruba and Curacao, sit directly along the same extended fault system that just demonstrated its capacity for catastrophic rupture. And these communities now face the reality that a portion of that system remains locked, loaded, and, according to peer-reviewed research published years before this year's disaster, structurally capable of an earthquake more than 5 times more powerful than the one that already killed thousands. There is also a second, separate fault worth understanding when assessing regional risk: the Oca-Ancon fault system running along Venezuela's northern coast between the Gulf of Venezuela and Lake Maracaibo. This fault has an unusually long recurrence interval of 2,000 to 4,000 years between major ruptures, and while the Oaks segment appears to still have time before its next expected event, the neighboring Ancon segment last ruptured roughly 4,500 years ago, meaning it has already reached and potentially passed its typical recurrence window. Geologists studying the region describe this section as a risk that should be taken seriously in its own right, entirely separate from the ongoing concerns tied to the Boconó San Sebastian El Pilar system further south and east. What ties all of these individual pieces together is a single, sobering geological reality that seismologists across the region are now emphasizing repeatedly. This is not a collection of isolated, unrelated fault segments scattered randomly across the Caribbean and northern South America. It is one continuous, deeply interconnected boundary between 2 major tectonic plates, a boundary that has already demonstrated, within the span of a single month, its ability to rupture catastrophically in one location and transfer measurable stress dozens to hundreds of miles away almost immediately afterward. Scientists monitoring the system are not predicting a specific date or location for the next major release. What they are saying, based directly on the events of this past month layered on top of years of prior peer-reviewed research, is that the risk sitting along the remaining locked segments of this fault, particularly the historic Boconó Fault and the boundary running beneath Trinidad and Tobago, is not a distant theoretical concern. It is an active, structurally documented hazard sitting directly beneath communities that have already lived through one of the worst earthquakes in the region's recorded history, with no guarantee that the fault has finished releasing what it has been storing. The physical mechanism behind the June doublet also deserves closer attention because it explains why the destruction was so severe despite the earthquakes originating relatively close to the surface rather than at extreme depth. Both the magnitude 7.2 foreshock and the magnitude 7.5 main shock were classified by the United States Geological Survey as shallow strike slip. Faulting, meaning the 2 sides of the fault slid horizontally past each other rather than one plate diving beneath the other the way it does in a subduction earthquake. Shallow strike-slip ruptures of this size tend to produce extremely violent, high-frequency shaking directly above the fault line, exactly the kind of shaking capable of collapsing poorly reinforced multi-story buildings in a matter of seconds, which is largely why La Guaira and Catia Lamar suffered such catastrophic building failures during the initial shock. complicating the picture further is the regional tectonic setting itself, which researchers describe as considerably more complex than a simple straight line boundary between two plates sliding past one another. Along Venezuela's coast, a crumple zone formed by coastal mountains sits where portions of the Caribbean plate have effectively accreted onto South America over geological time, with an offshore accretionary prism that has been deformed and folded by the ongoing collision. The Caribbean plate is not simply sliding eastward relative to Venezuela in a clean, uniform motion. It is simultaneously being pushed toward the coastline itself, while neighboring Colombia moves independently toward the northeast. This layered, three-dimensional complexity is exactly why a single fault system can produce such a wide variety of earthquake types and magnitudes across relatively short distances, from the pure, strike-slip doublet that struck near Caracas to the deeper, more diffuse shaking recorded near Tobago weeks later. For emergency planners and engineers across the wider Caribbean region, the practical implications of this ongoing risk are considerable. Building codes across many of the islands sitting along this fault system were established decades ago, often without the benefit of the detailed geodetic and seismic hazard research that has since confirmed just how much stress remains locked along specific segments, like the boundary near Trinidad and Tobago. Infrastructure planning, hospital capacity, and emergency response coordination across these islands now have to be weighed against research explicitly describing a nearby fault segment as theoretically capable of an earthquake more than 5 times larger than the disaster that just struck Venezuela, a scenario current infrastructure in several of these communities was never specifically designed to withstand. Scientists studying earthquake sequences on long strike-slip fault systems elsewhere in the world have documented a recurring and unsettling pattern that adds further weight to current concerns about this region. Major ruptures on one segment of an extended fault system have, in multiple well-studied historical cases, been followed by additional large earthquakes on neighboring segments within months, years, or in some cases decades, as the redistributed stress from the initial rupture gradually pushes adjacent locked sections closer to their own failure point. Researchers are careful not to treat this pattern as a guarantee of what will happen next along the Boconó-San Sebastián el Pilar system, since every fault system behaves somewhat differently based on its specific geometry, slip rate, and history. But the pattern is, well, established enough in the broader scientific literature that seismologists monitoring this exact region are treating the coming months and years as a period requiring close, sustained observation rather than routine background monitoring. As seismic networks across Venezuela, Trinidad, and the wider Eastern Caribbean continue recording aftershocks and any new seismic activity along this extended fault system, researchers expect to gain a clearer picture of exactly how much stress has shifted and toward which specific segments in the weeks and months following the initial June rupture. What is already established, based on peer-reviewed research published years before this disaster and confirmed by the sequence of events that has unfolded since, is that this fault system remains only partially released. The historic Boconó Fault continues carrying its own long overdue slip deficit. The boundary beneath Trinidad and Tobago remains locked and structurally capable of a significantly larger event, and the coastal uplift already documented in Trinidad stands as physical evidence that the stress from Venezuela's earthquake did not simply stay contained where it started,